Do you have anything to say for yourself, Emma? Benjamin's voice echoed through the dimly lit kitchen, each word sharp and unforgiving. Emma stood frozen, her hands trembling as they gripped the hem of her oversized sweater. The 13-year-old girl couldn't meet her father's eyes, which burned with disappointment and anger. I didn't mean for this to happen, Emma stammered, her voice barely audible. Didn't mean for it to happen? Abigail, her mother, hissed, her face twisted with disdain. You're 13, Emma. 13 years old, and now you're pregnant. Do you have any idea how much shame you've brought to this family? Emma's knees buckled, and she sank to the floor. Her tears streamed down her cheeks, but they couldn't extinguish the fire in her parents' eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered, her words faltering as she choked on her sobs. Please, I didn't want this. Benjamin slammed his fist against the table, causing the dishes to rattle. Sorry doesn't fix anything. Do you even understand what you've done? The whole town will be talking about us. Our family, our reputation, ruined because of your recklessness. Ben, stop wasting your breath on her, Abigail snapped, folding her arms. She made her choices. She can live with the consequences. She turned her icy gaze toward Emma, her voice devoid of any sympathy. You don't deserve to stay here. Pack your things and leave. Emma's head shot up in panic. No. Please, Mom. I don't have anywhere to go. Please don't send me away. She reached out, clinging to the edge of her mother's skirt, but Abigail shoved her away. Benjamin pointed to the door, his face hard as stone. Get out, Emma. Don't come back. It felt like the floor had crumbled beneath her. Emma's body went cold as her parents' words hung heavy in the air. Her hands shook violently, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst. Where will I go? She whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to do. That's your problem now, Benjamin growled. He turned his back to her as if she were a stranger. Outside, the rain poured mercilessly, drowning out the distant murmurs of neighbors who peeked through their curtains. Emma stood on the doorstep, drenched and trembling. The warmth of her home had been replaced with a harsh, unforgiving world. She didn't know where to turn. As she looked back at the closed door, she realized her parents weren't going to open it again. She was truly alone. The cold rain soaked through her clothes as she stumbled down the street. The houses she passed were dark, their windows glowing faintly from within. Every step felt heavier as despair settled deep into her chest. Her tears mingled with the rain as she whispered, "Why is this happening to me?" She wandered aimlessly, her small frame battered by the storm. At one point, she tried to take shelter in the doorway of an old shop, but the owner, a burly man with a scowl, shooed her away. Go somewhere else, kid. I'm not running a shelter. Rejected and shivering, Emma eventually collapsed on a park bench, clutching her stomach. Her hands pressed protectively over the tiny life growing inside her, a faint flicker of hope in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. Her teeth chattered as the cold seeped into her bones. She whispered to the night, "I'll be strong for you, little one. I'll keep going for you." The hours dragged on. The rain didn't stop, and Emma's body grew weaker. She curled up as tightly as she could, her breath shallow and labored. In the distance, she heard footsteps, but she was too tired to look up. She thought of her parents' harsh words and the cruel faces of her neighbors. She thought of the emptiness in her future. Then, a voice broke through the sound of the rain. "Child, what are you doing out here?" Emma blinked through her tears and saw a woman standing over her, holding a large, tattered umbrella. The stranger's face was soft and kind, her eyes filled with worry. She appeared to be in her 60s, her graying hair tied back in a loose bun. Emma tried to speak, but her lips were numb from the cold. "Come now, no need to say anything," the woman said gently, helping Emma to her feet. "You can't stay out here. You'll catch your death." Emma's legs buckled, but the woman caught her. "My name is Martha," she said. "I don't have much, but you'll be warm with me. Martha guided Emma to a small bakery nearby, the faint smell of bread wafting through the air. The shop was simple, with wooden shelves and a small counter, but the warmth inside was a stark contrast to the freezing rain outside. Martha sat Emma down by the fireplace and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "Drink this," she said, handing her a cup of tea. Emma held the cup with trembling hands. For the first time in hours, she felt the cold begin to ease. She looked up at Martha, her tears spilling over once more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Don't thank me yet," Martha said with a gentle smile. "You're safe for now, but you have a long road ahead of you, child." Emma nodded, her hands still shaking. For the first time since she'd been thrown out, she felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile light in the suffocating darkness. Emma woke up the next morning in Martha's bakery, still cocooned in the warm blanket she'd been given. The early rays of the sun peeked through the bakery's dusty window, glinting off shelves stacked with flour jars and mixing bowls. The gentle smell of rising dough filled the room. For a moment, Emma forgot the horrors of the night before. The relentless rain, the cold rejection from her family, and the despair that weighed her down like a heavy stone. But the moment didn't last. As she tried to stretch her aching limbs, her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in days. Her eyes fell on the small loaf of bread and glass of milk placed on the table beside her. "You're awake," Martha said, her voice kind but steady, as she walked over with a flour-dusted apron wrapped tightly around her. "Eat, child. You need your strength," Martha urged, sitting across from Emma. "Thank you," Emma whispered, her voice hoarse. She reached for the bread with trembling hands, but hesitated as tears welled in her eyes. Her parents' voices echoed in her mind. "Shameful. Disgrace. You don't deserve anything." She pulled her hands back, resting them on her lap. Martha tilted her head, her gaze softening. "What's wrong, child? Why won't you eat?" "I don't deserve it," Emma mumbled, her voice breaking. "I ruined my family's life. They hate me. Everyone hates me." Martha frowned and reached across the table, gently taking Emma's hands in her own. "Listen to me, child. I don't know what you've been through, but no one deserves to suffer the way you have. No one." She squeezed Emma's hands tightly. "You're not alone now. Eat." Emma nodded and took a tentative bite of the bread. The warmth spread through her body, and she swallowed hard, trying to keep the tears at bay. For the first time in days, she felt something other than hopelessness. She felt cared for. As the days went on, Emma found a small measure of comfort in the bakery. Martha, though firm, treated her with a kindness Emma hadn't experienced in years. "If you're going to stay here, you'll need to help out," Martha said one morning, handing Emma a broom. "It's not charity, child. It's a partnership. You work, you eat, and you rest." Emma nodded eagerly. She swept the floors, cleaned the counters, and even helped knead dough under Martha's watchful eye. She worked hard, hoping to repay the older woman's kindness. But even with Martha's protection, the world outside the bakery remained harsh and unkind. The small town was a place where rumors spread like wildfire. It didn't take long for people to notice Emma helping at the bakery. Whispers started. Stares lingered. Customers who used to come every morning began to hesitate. "Who's that girl?" a woman whispered loudly to Martha as Emma cleaned a nearby table. "She doesn't look right. I heard she's trouble." Martha straightened her back and fixed the woman with a steely glare. "What you've heard is none of my concern. She's a good girl, and she works hard. If you have a problem with that, you can take your business elsewhere." The woman huffed but didn't argue further. Still, not everyone was as accepting. Some customers stopped coming altogether, and the bakery grew quieter. Emma noticed the change and felt the weight of guilt pressing down on her. "I'm causing you trouble," Emma said one evening, sitting with Martha after closing time. The older woman had been counting the day's earnings, her face etched with worry as she stared at the meager pile of coins. If I wasn't here, people would still come. You wouldn't be losing money. Martha sighed and placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. Child, listen to me. I've lived a long life, and I've learned that people will always find something to talk about. If it's not you, it'll be someone else. Let them gossip. I don't regret helping you, and I never will. Despite Martha's reassurances, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was a burden. The whispers in town grew louder, and the hostility became harder to ignore. One day, as Emma took out the trash behind the bakery, a group of neighborhood boys cornered her. Hey, girl, one of them sneered, stepping forward with a smirk. What are you doing here? Don't you know this place doesn't want you? Emma froze, her heart pounding. I'm just trying to help, she stammered, clutching the trash bag tightly. Help? Someone like you? Another boy laughed cruelly. You're nothing but trouble. You should leave before things get worse. One of them shoved her, and Emma stumbled back, tears brimming in her eyes. Please, just leave me alone, she begged. What's going on here? Martha's voice cut through the air like a blade. She stormed out of the bakery, wielding a broom like a weapon. Get away from her. Now. The boys scattered, muttering under their breath, but the damage was done. Emma collapsed into Martha's arms, sobbing. Why do they hate me so much? She cried. I didn't do anything to them. Martha held her tightly, stroking her hair. Some people are cruel, child. It's not your fault. Don't let them break you. But the incidents didn't stop. More neighbors began to avoid the bakery, and Martha struggled to make ends meet. One afternoon, the landlord came by with a stern expression. You're behind on rent, Martha. If you don't pay by the end of the month, you'll have to leave. Martha tried to hide her worry, but Emma saw the strain in her eyes. That night, as Martha slept, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She couldn't let the woman who had saved her lose everything because of her. The next morning, Emma made a decision. I'll leave, she told Martha as they prepared the dough together. If I'm not here, people will come back. You won't lose the bakery. Martha frowned and shook her head. Don't be ridiculous, child. This is your home now. I won't let you go back out there. But Emma was determined. Late that night, while Martha was asleep, she packed her few belongings into a small bag. She left a note on the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face as she wrote, Dear Martha, thank you for everything you've done for me. You saved my life when no one else would, and I will always be grateful. But I can't let you lose your bakery because of me. I'll find a way to survive. Please don't worry about me. With love, Emma. She slipped out quietly, closing the door behind her. The cold night air bit at her skin as she wandered through the dark streets. She had no plan, no destination, only the hope that she could find a place where she wouldn't hurt anyone else. Emma eventually found a boarding house on the outskirts of town. The landlady, a gruff woman named Dolores, eyed her suspiciously. Room 3. Don't bother me if you can't pay, she said, tossing Emma a key. The room was small and damp, with peeling wallpaper and a creaky bed, but it was shelter. Emma curled up on the mattress, clutching her stomach as tears silently fell. We'll be okay, she whispered to the baby growing inside her. We have to be. But life at the boarding house was no kinder than the bakery. The other tenants whispered about Emma, their judgmental gazes following her every move. Children pointed at her belly and laughed, calling her names that cut deeper than any blade. Even Dolores accused her of stealing money when her rent came up short, though Emma swore she hadn't touched it. One night, Emma returned to her room to find the door ajar. Her belongings were scattered across the floor, and the small pouch of money she'd saved was gone. No, she whispered, falling to her knees. Please no. When she tried to tell Dolores, the woman dismissed her with a wave. Probably your fault for bringing trouble here, she muttered. Emma realized then that she couldn't stay. She packed what little she had left and left the boarding house the next morning, her heart heavy with despair. For days, she wandered the streets, surviving on scraps and sleeping in alleyways. Every step felt like a battle, but she refused to give up, for her baby, for the tiny flicker of hope that still burned inside her. Then, one night, as she huddled under an old bridge, she heard a familiar voice calling her name. "Emma, Emma, where are you?" She looked up and saw Martha standing in the rain, holding a flashlight and an umbrella. The older woman's face was etched with worry, her clothes soaked through. "Martha?" Emma whispered, her voice breaking. "You foolish girl," Martha said, rushing to her side. She knelt down and wrapped Emma in her arms, holding her tightly. "Do you know how worried I've been? Why did you leave?" "I didn't want to cause you any more trouble," Emma sobbed. "I thought you'd be better off without me." "Don't you understand, child?" Martha said, her voice trembling. "You're my family now. I would never abandon you." Emma collapsed into her arms, her tears mixing with the rain. For the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Martha had found her, and she wasn't alone anymore. Life at the bakery slowly returned to a fragile normalcy. Emma was back in the warmth of Martha's home, but she couldn't shake the overwhelming sense of guilt and fear. Every time the door to the bakery opened, her heart would race. She imagined the cruel boys returning, or angry neighbors bringing more accusations. But Martha's unwavering support kept her grounded. "You don't need to prove yourself to anyone, Emma," Martha would say every morning as they kneaded dough side by side. "You're stronger than you think, child. Don't let them define you." But the world outside wasn't so forgiving. Word of Emma's return spread quickly, and the town's whispers grew louder. Every trip to the market felt like a walk of shame. People would glance at her belly, their faces twisting in judgment before turning away. Some muttered cruel remarks under their breath. Others made no effort to hide their disdain. One day, Emma accompanied Martha to the market to buy supplies. As they approached the vegetable stall, Emma noticed a familiar face. Mrs. Crawley, the town gossip, who always seemed to know everyone's secrets. Mrs. Crawley spotted Emma and leaned closer to another woman, her voice loud enough for Emma to hear. "Can you believe she's still here? That poor Martha, harboring someone like her. It's shameful." Emma froze, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. She wanted to turn and leave, but Martha grabbed her hand and squeezed it tightly. "Hold your head up, Emma," she whispered. "Excuse me, Mrs. Crawley," Martha said loudly, her voice cutting through the chatter. "If you've got something to say, you can say it to my face." Mrs. Crawley faltered, her eyes narrowing. "Well, Martha, I just think you should be careful. A girl like her. You know what people are saying. It's not good for your bakery." Martha's gaze was like steel. "Let me tell you something, Mrs. Crawley. This girl is working harder than half the people in this town. She's kind, honest, and has more courage than you'll ever understand. If you have a problem with her, then you have a problem with me." Emma felt tears sting her eyes as Martha pulled her away from the stall. For the rest of the trip, no one dared say a word to them, but Emma could still feel their eyes on her. She kept her head down, swallowing the lump in her throat. Later that evening, as they closed up the bakery, Martha sat Emma down at the kitchen table. "You can't keep letting these people get to you," she said gently. "Their opinions don't matter. What matters is the kind of person you are. And you, Emma, are good and strong. You've been through so much already. Don't let them break you." Emma nodded, but her heart felt heavy. She wanted to believe Martha's words, but the weight of the town's hatred was crushing. She often found herself wondering if things would ever get better. One evening, as Emma was cleaning the bakery after closing, the door suddenly swung open. Her heart leapt in fear as Carlos and his two friends, the same boys who had cornered her weeks ago, walked in. Their grins were wide and menacing, and they reeked of alcohol. "What do you want?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Carlos smirked, leaning against the counter. "Relax, sweetheart. We're just here to talk." Emma backed away, her heart pounding. "You need to leave. Now." One of the boys laughed. Oh, come on. Don't be like that. We're just checking in. You've caused quite the stir in this town, you know? Carlos stepped closer, his eyes gleaming with malice. You think you can just come back here and act like you belong? Like you're not a disgrace? Emma's hands shook as she grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a rolling pin, and held it in front of her like a weapon. Get out, she shouted, her voice cracking. Carlos laughed, raising his hands mockingly. Oh, she's got a little fight in her. I like that. Before Emma could react, the door burst open again, and Martha stormed in, holding a broom. Out, all of you, she shouted, her voice filled with fury. If you so much as take another step, I'll have the police here before you can blink. Carlos sneered but backed away. This isn't over, he muttered as he and his friends left, slamming the door behind them. Emma collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with fear. Martha rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her. It's okay, child. They're gone. You're safe now. But Emma didn't feel safe. That night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about Carlos's words. You don't belong. You're a disgrace. The fear and shame twisted in her stomach like a knife. She couldn't let this continue. Not for her, and not for Martha. The next morning, Emma decided to confront the town's hostility head-on. She wrote a letter to the local church, asking the pastor if she could speak during Sunday service. Martha was hesitant when Emma told her about it. Are you sure about this, child? Martha asked. You don't owe these people anything. I know, Emma replied. But I need to do this, for me, and for my baby. I can't keep running from them. When Sunday arrived, Emma stood at the back of the church, her hands shaking as she waited for her turn to speak. The room was packed with familiar faces, neighbors, shopkeepers, even Mrs. Crawley. Their eyes widened as Emma walked to the front, her pregnant belly unmistakable beneath her simple dress. The pastor nodded encouragingly as Emma took a deep breath. I know most of you don't want me here, she began, her voice trembling. I've heard the whispers. I've seen the stares. And I know what you think of me. A hush fell over the congregation. Emma's eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of the people who had judged her so harshly. You think I'm a disgrace because I made a mistake, but I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness or your approval. I'm here to tell you that I'm not ashamed anymore. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but Emma pressed on. Yes, I'm 13 years old, and I'm pregnant. And yes, I was thrown out by my own family. But I've survived because of people like Martha, people who see me for who I am, not for the mistakes I've made. I'm not asking you to accept me. I'm asking you to stop tearing me down. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. I may be young, and I may be scared, but I'm not giving up. I'm going to raise this child, and I'm going to give them the life they deserve. Whether you support me or not is up to you, but I won't let your hatred define me anymore. By the time Emma finished, the room was silent. She turned and walked back to her seat, her heart racing. She didn't expect applause or sympathy, and she didn't get it. But as the service ended and people filed out, a few stopped to offer quiet words of encouragement. Martha beamed with pride as she walked beside Emma. You were incredible, child. I've never been more proud of you. Emma smiled faintly. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, not because the town had changed, but because she had found the strength to stand up for herself.